Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Hello, I'm Peter. Where are you from, originally?
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we're looking forward to today's interview with philosopher Peter S. Williams. Peter S. Williams is based in Southampton, England. He's a Christian philosopher and apologist, and he is the assistant professor in communication and worldviews at NLA University College at Gimlekollen, Kristiansand, Norway. He speaks internationally on behalf of the truth, goodness, and beauty of following Jesus. He's also a trustee of the Christian Evidence Society, a Montgomery Trust lecturer, and both a mentor and traveling speaker for the European Leadership Forum. Now, he's got a number of books, which we will link in the show notes, but today we're going to be talking a bit about his book that he's edited with many contributors called An Informed Cosmos, Essays on Intelligent Design Theory. Really interesting book, a lot of great contributions there. Chad, do you have any thoughts on the book and what we're expecting for today?
Yeah, well, as you know, Brian, if there was a stranded on a desert island author that one had to pick and you could only take their work with you, Peter S. Williams's work is probably what I would take with me. I thought the book was absolutely outstanding. I thought it was a great kind of survey of the current interaction between ID and evolution, particularly neo-Darwinism. And I was just really impressed with how many topics he was able to interact with and the amount of scholars. And of course, as I text you, the footnotes alone are just phenomenal and worth the price of the book. But of course, the content's excellent as well.
Yeah, I highly enjoyed it and recommend it, and looking forward to speaking to Peter. Let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Peter S. Williams, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me back. It's a delight.
Well, first off, tell us a little bit about this book, An Informed Cosmos. What do you mean by informed, and what have we got here?
Well, it's really a book on the theme of intelligent design theory. The subtitle of the book is Essays on Intelligent Design Theory, and it's one of a series of books that I've been doing over the last few years that are collections of essays on different themed topics, where I sort of spruce up and republish things that I've published in various venues, together with a substantial sort of introductory preface, kind of chapter length preface, get someone to write a foreword for me, stick them between some covers, and I've been able to produce a book a year for a few years by dint of this sneaky process of drawing on material that I've already published and theming them. But this one is on intelligent design theory, and the preface kind of lays out my kind of autobiographical journey with that topic, going from, although I was raised in a Christian home by two science teacher parents, a home that was very comfortable with, geology and the old age of the universe and of the earth and evolutionary theory. And when I went off to university, I would have considered myself, a thought through and informed theistic evolutionist. And it was as I studied in philosophy of science, when I was doing my philosophical studies at various universities, I got interested in philosophy of science as one of the areas that piqued my interest. And I kind of got into the debate about discussing how you define science and how to do science. What is science? What kind of explanations can count as being scientific and so on? And that drew to my attention some of the writings of folks in the ID movement, folks like Stephen Meyer, for example. And I came to the conclusion that the ID folks had got their philosophy of science correct. And that kind of opened me up to the further question of, well, did they have anything else that they were saying correct as well? So I kind of came in from this rather strange angle of the philosophy of science, which I think is really the kind of the tertiary issue in the discussion, as it were. But that's what brought me into this whole area. And then over the years, I've written quite a few essays. I published on Access Research Network website, which was an early active ID website, and so on. and I've kind of drawn on what I think are the cream of the crop of my ID publishing past and present in this book here as well.
I just want to say, you mentioned there that, this is pre-published work and things. And, I threw it in between a couple of book covers. I would want the reader to ignore that, because it gives the impression that, this is, just try to get a book out. This is absolutely not the case. I got through your preface, and then, I was listening to it text to speech in my headphones, and I was like, wow, that was the preface? Wow. And I looked at it, it was 25% through the book. And I'm like, that was a monster. This was really great content. And I haven't even actually started the book itself, or the essays.
Yeah.
And, this is great material. It may have been stuff that you didn't write specifically for the book. You had it. But as you say, if it's the cream of the crop that you've put together, I think that's a more reasonable description of the book for maybe potential readers who are looking into intelligent design.
Yeah, Brian. And I would want to say, too, that, Peter, I told Brian before the podcast started that if there was a desert island author, that you were going to be stuck on a desert island, you could only take their work with you. I think your stuff would probably be mine. That'd probably be my pick, just as a compliment. Every time I read one of your books, it's just so engaging. Absolutely love your writing style and the interaction that you have with such a vast array of authors. But the thing too about this book is that I thought it was the best interaction I've ever seen about assessing intelligent design. And I thought it was very current, and I thought it cleared up a lot of misunderstandings. And so I would want to echo what Brian is saying, and don't see this as, I don't want to read these old published essays. This is very current. This is very engaging.
Yeah.
So just well done.
Thank you. Yeah. Particularly American listeners should put my opening comments in the context of typical English self-deprecating humor.
Yes.
Maybe we missed that, Brian.
So,
just like Tolkien, man.
As you say, there's a very substantial new preface together with a foreword written by Stephen Meyer himself. Yeah. And then the essays are an essay that I had published in Philosophia Christi Philosophy Journal, which was a peer-reviewed paper, and then additional papers that I have interacting with the thinking of Thomas Nagel in one paper, and the discussion about philosophy of science, particularly with Michael Roos and Philip Johnson. And then I have a paper that's the end of a substantial debate that I had with a theistic evolutionist called Dennis Alexander. But you can understand the whole debate from reading that end of that debate.
Yes.
And then some short little pieces, including a piece I wrote recently on a recent discussion between Richard Dawkins, the British zoologist, and Francis Collins, who the geneticist from America, who's a theistic evolutionist. So the book, both, as you say, interacts with the kind of Darwinian, philosophically Darwinian side of the discussion, but also with the theistic evolutionist side. And of course, that's close to my heart because that's where I came from. And when you say sort of clearing up sort of mistaken ideas, well, those are the ideas that I had to kind of journey through, seeing what the problems with those ideas were to arrive at becoming convinced of ID myself. And as a philosopher, what I'm particularly interested in and kind of bringing to the discussion is clarity about concepts, clarity about argumentation, and so pointing out fallacies in people's understanding of definitions or use of argumentation on both sides of the bookend of the debate, as it were. There is something that I think the book particularly kind of brings to the table, as it were.
Yeah, I agree. So one thing I wanted to just start with, because I think that when you're reading about this discussion, regardless of what side it's from, sometimes there is not always clarity on what intelligent design actually is. And what it is not. And so before we start diving into more specific questions and themes, I thought it would be helpful for our listeners to just have you kind of talk about what intelligent design is. I know in the book you talk about, there's a difference between ideas design detection versus intelligent design theory. And so I just thought it'd be helpful to kind of unpack that from the onset for our listeners.
Yes, that's right. So you can look at ideas as a very kind of broad scientific area that's looking at how do we detect evidence of design? How do we make warranted inferences from evidence, from data, to the conclusion that there is genuine design and the input of intelligence to arrange reality. And then you have a specific kind of application of that general concept and discussion of, can we do this? How best do we do this? You can apply that in all sorts of different, scientific fields. So you could apply that within like forensic science, forensic engineering, in computer sciences, in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, kind of looking for signals from space that would indicate that they had an intelligent source, etc., etc. Where it becomes controversial is when you apply it to something that we would kind of categorize as nature. If you apply it to, say, the fine-tuning of the cosmos in cosmological terms, or if you apply it to information systems and information processing and so on within biological life, like the origin. Where do you get the origin of enough information working together to have something capable of even undergoing Darwinian processes of evolution in the first place? And if you say, maybe there's data there that passes through the same kind of criteria that you would apply in these other scientific fields, and in those situations points to intelligence, what do you do when you have data from cosmology or from biology or from genetics and molecular biology and so on that seems to pass the same kind of design detection criteria and thus points to intelligence? All right. What I think you have to do is separate off the discussion, the kind of philosophical discussion about, well, what's the best explanation of that intelligence that you've inferred? What is intelligence? What kind of intelligence would that be in that situation? And so on. An analogy I give is like two people may disagree philosophically about what human intelligence is. One may be a materialist who thinks that human intelligence is nothing but the operation of brain, and one may be a substance dualist who thinks that intelligence crucially relies upon a person having a substantial soul, right? So they differ about what intelligence is, but they can both look at the same data and use the same criteria and say, yeah, X is probably the product of intelligence. But then they have to go down the pub and have an argument about what intelligence is, or so on, or a discussion about who the intelligence would be. It's very different. If you see like a crop circle, and one person says, "Oh, look, evidence of aliens." Right. Well, the other person doesn't say, "Well, I'm skeptical about the existence of aliens, therefore that crop circle is not the product of intelligence." They probably say, therefore, that crop circle is probably the product of humans in that situation. But we can obviously have a debate about who the best designer candidate is. And that issue becomes very prominent, obviously, when you try making design inferences within things like molecular biology or the fine-tuning of the cosmos. But there is still a debate to be had there, where different worldviews can try and interpret that explanation and that data in terms comfortable to their own worldview. So it doesn't, an inference to design doesn't end the discussion, but it starts a discussion.
I really like how you put that. Yeah, one of the fascinating things that you really challenged me on in the book is a few themes that I think are interconnected, and they also follow up well to what you said, is this idea of there's this debate of should ID be considered science? right? And I really like the way you approach that question in the book. Is that really ultimately the most important question? I'm trying to ask without stealing your thunder. And then secondly, what was even more interesting to me was this idea of how do you define science, and how there's actually not like a settled definition, and how important that is. And so can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. As I say, I came into this from the philosophy of science discussion, but I actually do think it's kind of secondary, tertiary to the issue here. I would say ID, really, you've got two premises that lead to a conclusion. It's kind of that simple. Premise one is, do you think that we've got some reliable design inferring methodology, some kind of criteria that we can apply to data such that we can reliably infer design from that data? And of course, lots of people think that that's true, whether or not they agree with intelligent design theory. And that's actually something that Philosophia Christi paper in the book goes into, looking at design inference through the methodology that's known as looking for specified complexity, showing that people who disagree with intelligent design theory, both on the atheist side of the discussion, the sort of philosophically Darwinian side of the discussion, and the theistic evolutionist side of the discussion, are actually happy that looking for specified complexity is a reliable indicator of design, that this is helps you warrant an inference to design. So that's premise one, that we've got some sort of criteria that allows us to draw inferences when we have relevant data. The second premise would be that we've got some data within nature that passes through the criteria. Now, if both of those premises are true, A, we have a reliable design inferring criteria. Two, we have some data that passes through that criteria. The conclusion that follows is that there is something in nature that warrants an inference to design. So if you get that far, well, then you can have a discussion about, well, what kind of subject are we going to describe that as? What academic field are we going to put drawing that conclusion within? Okay. Well, in a sense, like, who cares? If you've got a sound argument with, two true premises, a conclusion that follows, right? So that conclusion that there is genuine design within nature, if that's true, well, that's the most important thing here, right? Whether you call the truth of that proposition philosophy or theology or history or science, right? Okay. And if you really don't want to call it science, my argument would be kind of pragmatic. Well, what are you going to do? Suddenly defund all the biology departments and send the money across campus to the philosophy department, the theology, whatever you've decided that this, ID stuff is, in order to, so that we can increase our genuine understanding of how nature actually came about and works and so on.
Right.
Rather than just saying, oh, well, okay, that increases our understanding of the reality of nature. Well, that's what science is about. Science is about understanding the truth about the world, particularly through methods that pay attention to how evidence confirms or disconfirms theories about that, or something like this, Whereas a lot of people want to kind of smuggle into how we define science, some kind of limit on the kind of explanation or the kind of entities that can feature in the explanations of science. And as I argue in the book, when you try and limit science in that kind of way, you end up kind of gerrymandering your conclusion in advance of looking at the evidence, and you find it very difficult to find consistent definitions of science when you try and restrict it beyond something plain and straightforward, like the search for truth about reality. In a sense, I would argue that science used to be called natural philosophy, and then it kind of budded off from the discipline of philosophy within the university to become its kind of own department. And a Christian reverend in Britain 150 years ago or something, 200 years ago, coined the term science for that. But, whether you call it science or whether you call it natural philosophy, we kind of want to understand the truth about the physical world around us, its history, how things in it came about, etc.
Yeah, and I think it has practical application for conversation too, because if I'm in a conversation and somebody wants to make the interaction all about the definition of, whether or not ID is science, I felt like what I read in your book would allow me to say, well, it depends on what you mean by science. And that's an interesting discussion. But ultimately, let's just look at the premises and see if they're true.
Yeah.
And it kind of keeps the main thing, which is incredibly important because these conversations tend to get derailed so easily.
Right. Yeah. Propositions can be true whether or not they're scientific.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And the people who are going to disagree with that have a very hardline scientistic understanding of epistemology. That there are well-known critiques of that kind of hardline scientism out there, but it ends up cutting its own throat, basically. So, keep the main thing, as you say. The question is truth, not what academic field is this, what do we call it, how do we define that subject area. Well, okay, if ID ends up being true but outside of your definition of that subject area, well, I think your subject area has become a lot less interesting. You have science according to your ID excluding definition, and this is on the assumption that ID is true, right? But I'm going to have a new subject that actually tells me the truth about reality that, in a way that your science doesn't allow it to get to, and I'm going to call my subject schmience. Now, which are you interested in? A subject called science, which stops itself from getting at something that's true about reality for ideological purposes, or schmience, which actually tells you the truth about reality. Right? And if you frame it that way, it becomes like, well, it's a no-brainer, right? So really the question hinges on, is ID true? And that hinges on the two questions: do we have a reliable method of inferring design? And is there data within the natural world that passes through that criteria?
It's a great point.
It seems to me that one of the biggest hurdles to try to get over is this idea coming from those who are wedded to an evolutionary point of view or a materialist point of view, is that they may argue that, hey, these ID people, they're religious people and they can't help but impose their worldview when they're looking at the data. But in my mind, that seems to be sort of tacitly admitting that they're doing the same thing, because they are saying, oh, you're looking at the data, you can't help but be informed by where you want to go with it. But they're disallowing anything that's not materialist. So it would seem like they're not following the data. They're assuming the end point, and then they're working towards it. That they would use that against the ID people seems sort of back to that self-defeating idea.
Yeah, I agree. And it's back to the philosophy of science, rather than kind of gerrymandering the definition. So you've made up your mind in advance of looking at the evidence. What the ID folks argued for was saying we want a so-called open philosophy of science that specifically doesn't make up its mind about what the conclusion of the investigation is going to be before we've gone in search of looking at what does the actual evidence indicate, and then let the chips fall where they may. The ID doesn't say, okay, we start with the assumption that there are, that things are made by some kind of intelligence, and then, gosh, we've arrived at the conclusion that intelligence was involved. Of course, that's ridiculous. But equally, as you say, it's, I think, ridiculous to kind of say we start with the assumption that whatever explains the natural world around us, intelligence was not involved. Oh gosh, we've arrived at a conclusion that's compatible with the assumption that intelligence was. The atheist philosopher of science, Bradley Monton, basically makes this argument and says, if you gerrymander the definition of science in that way, you stop science from being a search for the truth. Instead, you turn science into a search for the best theory that we can come up with for explaining the data of nature that is consistent with the assumption that naturalism is true, or that no intelligence of any kind was involved in producing anything within the natural world, right? And it says, well, that's no longer just a search for the truth. That is, a search for the best that we can come up to, subject to this philosophical assumption that we're just bringing to the table, and that we're not letting the evidence call that assumption into question. So we're not searching for the truth anymore. And I think Monton is right about that. And we need a philosophy of science that doesn't make us assume the answers we're going to arrive at before we've looked at the evidence.
So switching gears here a little bit, you mentioned Stephen Meyer writing the foreword to the book, and he brought up a theme that I kind of wanted to hash out here a little bit. He says, at a time when leading evolutionary biologists are explicitly acknowledging a crisis in the explanatory power of evolutionary theory, many Christians and religious scientists are urging fellow believers to accept evolution as the means by which God created. And so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about kind of that phenomenon that's happening right now, and what do you think's behind that? What do you think's going on?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that there is a growing discussion between what we could call the kind of standard kind of what you got taught in school, what you got taught in college textbook, neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, and secular evolutionary biologists and so on who are saying that theory doesn't hack it, doesn't explain the full range of data that we now know. That process obviously does some things, but it doesn't cover the territory. It explains the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest, as it's sometimes been put. That the origination of animal forms, body plans, and so on is actually impossible to explain on that kind of gene-centric view of life, because there is information in creatures outside of the information that's within the genes. Genes code for making proteins, and proteins fold and then jointly do various jobs within bodies. But the information for how to make the creature that those proteins are doing jobs within is not itself in the genes. Surely there's information outside of that, and so on and so forth. And so there is this kind of various people putting forward other aspects of the world that they think need to be taken into account. I think it's some work on so-called natural genetic engineering, as it's being called, where the idea that when genes mutate, they don't do so according to neo-Darwinism in a way that is directed at being beneficial for the organism. It's just random, right? But there's research showing that under certain selection pressures, creatures can vary their DNA in certain places faster under pressure to kind of find solutions for the relevant kind of problem. That there are kind of these kind of feedback systems within life that help them cope with selection pressures under certain conditions and so on. And that's all very interesting, but it just kind of pushes back the question of, well, where did that system that does that come from? Did that system that does that evolve by a neo-Darwinian process? Can that account for it or not? And so on. So there's this whole group of scholars who are saying that this kind of standard textbook neo-Darwinism doesn't really do it. It's part of the picture, but it can't be the whole picture. But they're trying to fill in the whole picture, still subject to this limitation that whatever we use to fill in the picture with, it mustn't mention genuine intelligence, genuine kind of teleology. And it's that assumption that the ID folks are calling into question. So, many of the same critiques of neo-Darwinism are shared by both those groups, the kind of third way crowd in evolutionary biology and ID. But the options as to what resources you might appeal to overcome the explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, that's where that along philosophical lines the debate remains to be had as well.
Hmm. And what do you make of those, as Meyer put it there? He said, there are many Christians and religious scientists that are urging fellow believers to accept evolution as the means by which God created. Do you see that as well? And I mean, from reading your book, yes. And but then what do you make of that? Do you see that as problematic?
That's quite down the line from my thinking about ID, as it were.
Okay.
Again, ID would say, yes, of course, there are natural processes, the result of the capacities of the physical objects that we study in science that do things, like the neo-Darwinian process. Certainly that does happen. These other processes that the third way folks would point to, some of those processes clearly exist and do things. But ID would say that at various data points, and different ID theorists may disagree about which data points maybe here would be included, but that there are various data points of data within the natural world that do genuinely point to design. And I'm quite kind of maximalist on this. I kind of think that the fine-tuning of the cosmos points to design. I think there's a design inference to be made from the origin of life. I think there are design inferences to be made from the large increases in information in life that happens around things like the explosion of body plans in the Cambrian explosion. I think you can make design inferences from large amounts of information processing and so on in life, from the irreducible complexity of certain biomolecular systems within life, along the lines that Michael Behe argues. I think there's a whole host of different data points, if you like, that point to design being the best explanation for those data points. Now, particularly because you've got the background of the fine-tuning of the cosmos, you kind of say, okay, there's an intelligently designed general cosmic background of laws and starting conditions. And then within that designed context, there are things that happen according to those designed laws and starting conditions, but without any additional input of information. And there are other things like, say, the origin of life that seem to point to an additional input of information, and an additional activity of intelligence somehow getting into the system at that point. Okay, making that argument, I think, and saying, yeah, I think it's legitimate to call that scientific argument, that's intelligent design theory. Now, what philosophical worldview do you think makes most sense of that scientific theory? Well, okay, as a Christian, I think Christianity does, right? Surprise, surprise, right? But, other people with other worldviews will, of course, argue for their worldview being the best explanation of that. And I think people with a naturalistic worldview can try and do that. If, like Elon Musk, you think that our entire reality is a virtual computer simulation, well, that's an intelligent design theory. It's just, it's an atheistic intelligent design theory. Or you might say, okay, yeah, there's evidence for design within the origin of life on Earth. Clearly, it was the aliens that did it. And those aliens, like, Professor Dawkins says it's possible, famous interview with Ben Stein, Dawkins said, it's possible that life on Earth could be the product of design, but, maybe it was aliens or whatever, but those aliens would themselves have to be the product of evolution.
Right.
So we kind of push it back a stage. Or members of the naturalistic Raelian UFO religious movement, believe that humans are the creation of intelligent aliens. And if you point out to them that kind of pushes back the question a step, and but surely, wouldn't those aliens contain any specified complexity, which would in turn point to design? They would say, well, yes, those aliens were created by other aliens, and so on ad infinitum. And they're willing to accept the existence of an infinite regress in their worldview. Now, I think infinite regresses are problematical, and that's why I think cosmological arguments for God are good arguments for the existence of a designer who does not contain specified complexity.
Right.
Right? So, but here you see, we're into a discussion between different metaphysical worldviews about the nature of that designing intelligence. That's a philosophical discussion downstream from the conclusion of ID.
I see.
And then, of course, within a Christian worldview, you could have different views of how, in coming up with a synoptic Christian worldview, best to integrate the conclusion of intelligent design with your theology, with your different ways in which different Christians read and interpret the scripture, quite apart from how they integrate it or are influenced in that interpretation by what they think the scientific evidence points to, and so on and so forth. So it's really kind of downstream from the whole discussion.
That makes sense. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Well, I'm curious, Peter, you mentioned at the top of the interview how your story is that your view used to be theistic evolution, that I can accept Christianity, God exists, but God used evolution in some way. So I wonder, what are the major strands of evidence that led you to change your view on this? Because maybe some Christians who hold to theistic evolution would be like, well, it's the agreed upon paradigm from quote unquote science. And so I don't have time for all of that. Fine. God used it. And in a way, that's an intelligent design in the sense that he had to sort of front load these systems to come about. So maybe it's not random on a theistic evolution view. It's sort of a directed evolutionary course, sort of like this is the unfolding of how life and humans came about over long periods. So I kind of bundled a few different ideas there in that question, but I'm interested in what are the main strands that changed your mind and what the changing of your view looked like.
Yeah, well, there we could separate a couple of different possible theistic evolutionist views there. Indeed, could be those who would kind of say, the Darwinian process in the sense of genuinely random variations of natural selection, that can account for the biological data in front of us, and that a world in which that process would happen was set up by God. Maybe he would know what the result of that process would be, but that process is not in any sense actually guided by God in its unfolding. Versus those who would say, I think that the kind of that process is actually intelligently guided by God. It's not just God relying upon the inherent chance capacities of the nature that he's made, but God actually intelligently guiding the nature that he's made. And you see that those are two different views. The difference between that second view and intelligent design, which also believes, intelligent design that believes an intelligence guided at least some bits within a theistic framework. The theistic intelligent design theorist is obviously going to think that intelligence is God intelligently guiding things within the framework. So you might think, so what's the difference between a sort of a theistic evolution, God guiding, versus a intelligent design theorist who believes that the designer is God, who did the guiding? Well, it's because the intelligent design theorist thinks that you can infer, at least to as far as an intelligence, by looking at the scientific data, that the idea that there was intelligent guidance going on, is something that is a warranted conclusion you can make from looking at the data. The theistic evolutionist thinks that you can't do that. They say, I believe it was guided because of my theology, not because you can look at the world and say, aha, look, there's evidence of design here. Or at the very least, that doing that is not scientific, which the ID theorist thinks it is. So you start to get these fine-grained kind of differences between, okay, even if we all agree that God did it, did he actually just make a process that would happen, or did he guide it? Can we infer? Do we just bring that knowledge to looking at the world, or can we infer that knowledge from the world? And is inferring that knowledge from the world scientific or not? And are we here doing, natural theology, which is an argument for God from the evidences of nature, to quote William Paley, or are we actually, as the ID theorists folks would say, more in agreement with David Hume, actually, the famously skeptical Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, that design arguments, well, they might at best get you as far as design, But that's not the same as getting you to the conclusion that the designer is God, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's an additional step here that needs to be made in the argument. If you want to go from an argument for ID and turn that into a piece of natural theology, to get from the conclusion there's intelligent design in nature to the conclusion God is the designer of various things in nature, well, you need another premise to fill in that gap. Otherwise, you have an unsound argument. So to make a valid argument there, you need an additional premise that the best explanation of that design that you've inferred is a theistic explanation. So there are actually a number of, it's not just like there's theistic evolution and there's intelligent design, and, of course, Christians can accept both, but actually it's a number of sort of subtly but importantly different ways of looking at that along a kind of spectrum.
I find that those explanations really helpful. That helps me see the different nuances there.
In the book does that really well too. That's a good way of putting it, Brian, is I think the book helps you see the different nuances within the discussion that are important to bring out. I know I interrupted you there, Brian, but I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what you were saying.
Terrible. Unacceptable.
I'm fired.
Restarting the interview.
Without me.
Well, evidentially, what were the main strands for you that sort of tipped the balance? Because you're content to accept theistic evolution in whatever variant, but then you're like, no, the evidence tips the scales. What were those strands?
For me, when I sort of first kind of met intelligent design theory, as it continues to be the case, a lot of the focus of the discussion is put upon the biological aspects of intelligent design. But I would include the cosmological aspects as well. So the whole question of the explaining the fine-tuning of the cosmos, which is an argument that I'd met in philosophy, in kind of natural philosophy, in philosophy of religion, the fine-tuning. But then ID seemed to be this whole discussion about biology, right? And within that area, the first thing that I met was the argument about the information in DNA, which is really an argument that goes back to at least Michael Polanyi in the 1960s, arguing that life was irreducible to simple physical laws, kind of in the way in which writing written in ink on a page is irreducible to, and thus inexplicable by, natural laws. And I kind of first met that argument through writings of folks like American philosopher Nancy Pearcey, and then later Stephen Meyer as well. So it was about kind of the information content of life and basically explaining life at all, kind of the origin of life. How could there be this sort of information within life? And then later on, I read Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box when that came out, because this was all happening for me in the kind of mid to late 1990s when I'm getting into this, right? So you have to kind of project back into what literature was coming out at that point. So I was very much kind of following along the track with the publication of Behe's books and so on. So that then got me into the whole discussion of irreducible complexity, which is just a kind of subset of specified complexity. If something has irreducible complexity, means it's got multiple closely interacting parts that all have to work together to achieve a particular function, whereby if you take away one of the core parts of that arrangement of bits, it stops achieving that function.
Right. Behe uses the mousetrap, like is the infamous
analogy.
Example.
But and that's something that I debate quite a bit in the essay that's interacting with Dennis Alexander in the book. His critiques of Behe's arguments and so on that I attempt to counter in the book. So I went from the information in life and the kind of very origin of life itself, and reading books like The Mystery of Life, Life's Origins by Thaxton and collaborators in earlier editions. It's out in a nice new edition fairly recently from the Discovery Institute with a load of other papers commenting on the kind of state of the debate about the origin of life. If any listeners are interested in the origin of life issue, I would recommend the Discovery Institute's new edition of The Mystery of Life's Origin. But then the arguments about irreducible complexity from Behe and his more recent discoveries about the very often devolutionary processes within life, where things under Darwinian selection pressure actually find it much easier to get survival advantages by jettisoning information rather than constructing large amounts of new information, and so on. So that was kind of the trajectory that I took, and marrying that with saying that the discussion that had been going on for a while within kind of natural philosophy of religion about the fine tuning was actually came under the bracket of intelligent design theory. And I would say someone who says, yeah, the evidence of fine tuning passes through a design inferring criterion of some kind and points to design, genuine design of some kind, I think, and who says, yeah, and I think that's a scientific argument, I would classify them as within the ID school, even if they thought that all of the arguments about biological design fell down because they thought the data didn't warrant them. They would agree that we have a design detection criteria and that inferring design is scientific, but that doesn't mean that they agree with every example. You might, for example, think that there's good evidence from the origin of life, but Behe's irreducible complexity thing, that doesn't work, or so on. So, you don't all have to, it's not a monolith. It's not a monolith. Any more than, as I argue in the book, actually the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is a kind of a monolithic thing that you have to take or leave altogether. As I point out, Darwin himself didn't nail his clothes to the mast as about whether life had a single origin or a multiple origin. These days, the standard theory goes back to a last universal common ancestor and back to a universal common ancestor. But there are secular scientists who accept common ancestry, but who reject universal common ancestry, for example. So it's not a monolithic thing on either side. And again, it's this philosophical thing of being precise about your definitions and categories, and seeing that there's nuance between different positions, and those nuances really matter when you're trying to get at truth.
Yes. And again, the book demonstrates that very well.
Maybe nodding back to the title, Informed Cosmos, one of the main sort of features of design inferences and detection is the aspect of information. And can you kind of give us just an overall sketch of what information is and how something being specified and complex results in a legitimate inference to design?
Yeah, well, I actually quote some definitions in some of the front pieces of the book. Information, noun, knowledge or intelligence, facts, data, the attribute inherent in and communicated by one of two or more alternative sequences or arrangements of something, such as nucleotides in DNA or binary digits in a computer program that produces specific effects. So you've got various options, and you've excluded a whole bunch of options to settle on one particular option. That's a kind of specification of information. Information is another way of talking about specified complexity. Complexity is where you have contingency. Things can be different ways, and you have a lot of different ways that it can be. And so I think it's best to kind of bring these home with, folks like William Dembski, if you want to get into the kind of mathematical details and formalism and so on of the background of this. But as a mere philosopher rather than a mathematician, Dembski's a mathematician and a philosopher, right?
Right.
But folks like Maya and myself, we're from the philosophy department only, and we like these nice kind of concrete examples. So to quote an example from William Lane Craig that I use in the book, he says, imagine yourself playing a game of poker. In a poker game, any particular, specific, deal of cards is equally and highly improbable. That is, it's complex, it's improbable, it's one out of a large number of possibilities. So any deal of cards is equally and highly improbable. It's one possible arrangement of cards out of all of the possible arrangements of cards of the size of a hand. Okay? But if you find that every time a certain player deals, he gets all 4 aces, you can bet that this is the result not of chance, but of design. So it's the getting all 4 aces is specified as a pattern that will, lead you to win the game. It achieves this result that sets it apart from all the other hands that you could have, been randomly dealt, as it were. So, if your cowboy's playing poker, and every time this particular cowboy, with the 10-gallon hat deals the cards, he ends up getting all 4 aces, and you say, "I suspect you're cheating." And he says, "Well, there's nothing suspicious going on here. I mean, any hand of cards that we get dealt, they're all equally improbable." Well, yes, but it's the combination of highly an improbable event with that event being specified, being kind of set apart in this way, whether by some sort of functional thing that it achieves. Dembski has cashed it out in a few different ways over the years. He talks about if it's got a short description. He says events that have high probabilistic complexity, that is, improbable events, high probabilistic complexity, but whose identifying patterns have low descriptive complexity. So think of Scrabble. You're pulling letters out of a Scrabble bag, sight unseen. Well, of course, occasionally those letters will form an English word, a short English word, like, the or this. Okay. Well, that hits a specification. The or this is a word in English. There's lots of arrangements of letters of the English alphabet that are not words in English. Most of the arrangements that you could make out of letters are not words in English. There's this small subset of those arrangements which are words in English. So if you pull out of the bag you've hit a specification, but you haven't done so at very long odds. It's not unlikely enough to make you suspicious. But if, like Arthur Dent in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when they're looking for the great question, you're using Scrabble tiles and you pull them in sequence and they spell out what is 9 times 10 or whatever. I forget what the specific one they drew out in Hitchhikers is, but it draws out, like a sentence or a paragraph of grammatical text. You would immediately suspect that someone was playing some kind of trick on you. You wouldn't think, "Oh, that's lucky of me." There's a certain point of complexity beyond which just saying, "Oh, that's lucky," doesn't really cut it as the explanation. And in our experience, when really, really complicated events that hit specifications, when we know where they came from intelligences. And so by standard inference, in cases where we see parallel cases of similarly specified events that are, similarly complex, we can infer to design as the best explanation for them by inference. It's not a knockdown argument, QED, therefore, mathematically, but it's a good scientific inference to the best explanation. That's the form of argumentation that's being used there.
Well, I have a question. You're saying that, obviously we can recognize design, but at the same time, we can also recognize when things aren't designed. So I wonder if that itself is a design inference, only looking at it from the opposite way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure that. So if you came into a room, as I say, and you saw Scrabble tiles arranged out, spelling out a poem by G.K. Chesterton on the table, you would immediately infer that was the product of design, because it's an example of specified complexity. But if you came into the room and saw Scrabble tiles just strewn around a table or in sequences that didn't spell out any English words or words in any language that you knew of, so on, you wouldn't infer design, but you wouldn't be in a position to say, the arrangement of those tiles on that table is not the product of design. Because they could well be, you know, unbeknownst to you, before you were in the room, there was me in the room taking out Scrabble letters very carefully from the bag and precisely arranging them on the table in an apparently random configuration.
Or you might have some kind of code that you correlated to each letter or something like that.
Right, that you don't know about. Okay?
Right.
And so you wouldn't notice. And so you can't look at data and infer the absence of design from it. You can only look at data and infer the presence of design.
If you do start with a Christian worldview and you have theological beliefs such as God is sovereign, then you could look at quote unquote apparent chaos in the cosmos or things that you haven't yet seen the design and say, well, if God is sovereign, then there must be a purpose behind this, because for instance, I wouldn't believe that God does anything chaotically or randomly without a purpose to it.
Well, there again, I think different Christians might have different theologies on that.
Yeah.
Some Christians would believe in a much more kind of meticulous divine providence than others would. Some might well believe that God is happy to create things that have capacities to randomly do things by chance. Yeah, he would foreknow that. Or some Christians would believe that by his divine middle knowledge, he would know what certain things would do were he to create them, but that they would do that thing randomly were he to create them, and he's happy to create them. So the fact that they exist and that they do that, yes, is down to God, but there's also a sense in which he didn't meticulously guide that particular process. So kind of how the event gets there within a theology of monotheism is, again, itself a kind of complex issue,
Well,
right?
I digress. But there was another thing you mentioned in your chapter about Paley's watchmaker illustration. I thought that was very insightful. What you said about it is that, you know, he wasn't arguing from analogy like the universe is like a watch, but you were saying that his illustration basically shows that we can detect design from certain features. And I wonder, some people would say, oh, that you're just appealing to intuitions. We might have those intuitions, but are they only intuitions, or have we just not thought about those things deep enough?
Well, however you categorize them, they're things that people are very happy to use in all sorts of sciences every day, as well as in all sorts of everyday situations. So not only when you're suspecting people of cheating at playing poker, or cheating at playing the lottery, or cheating at the scientific results that they publish in a peer-reviewed journal and then later found out to have jerry-rigged the results or whatever. Those can be instances of design detection. So you need design detection to keep science honest, and lots of sciences use design detection, from cryptography, computer sciences, forensic science, forensic engineering, archaeology, the SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Loads of fields of sciences use design detection, and we rely upon that knowledge to do things practically in life and so on. So I think we've got very good grounds for thinking that we can reliably detect design. Where this becomes controversial, as I say, is when you want to apply that within fields where people, for philosophical reasons, would like to exclude the possibility that intelligence is involved, particularly where the involvement of intelligence might seem to suggest the existence of an intelligence that's non-reducible to explanations that fit within a materialistic worldview, right? Because the materialists are happy to infer intelligence in forensic science or archaeology or cryptography or in SETI. So it's not as if they're saying, actually, you're not allowed to infer intelligence. If they want to say you're not allowed to infer to intelligence, then we have to rule all of those sciences non-scientific. But if you let intelligence in, then how come you're not allowed to infer to intelligence from the irreducible complexity of the blood clotting cascade, if that's a true instance of specified complexity, etc.? Well, because people start thinking, maybe you're talking about God. Well, maybe we're talking about intelligent aliens who have an entirely naturalistic explanation. Oh, but where would they come from? Wouldn't they rely upon, well, are you happy with an infinite regress or not? Do you turn that into an argument for the existence of an explanation in terms of an intelligence that does not contain specified complexity, that therefore that does not exist contingently as things with specified complexity do? Well, now you're starting to sound like you're mounting some kind of cosmological argument from contingency to the existence of a necessary creator of the universe, right? And oh dear, that's sounding a bit too much like God for comfort with a metaphysically naturalistic worldview. Well, okay, but is your metaphysically naturalistic worldview open to counter argument that goes from, starts with roots in the standard kind of methodology that you're happy to apply elsewhere in the world? Or do you, as I say, make up your mind about what the conclusions are going to have to be in advance of looking at the data?
Very good.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if, as you're reading the literature and publishing on it yourself and interacting with so many different people on these topics, is there one or two kind of prevailing errors or mistakes that you see people making when they're addressing or thinking about intelligent design?
Well, there's a whole bunch, I think, but I think it's important, as we've said, to highlight the secondary nature of this discussion about, is it science or not, and focus on the question of is it true? And that boils down to these two questions of, is there a reliable methodology of inferring to intelligence, and is there data that passes through it? And actually, the first premise is not controversial in all sorts of scientific fields, and that methodology of using specified complexity as a way of inferring design is accepted implicitly and or explicitly by plenty of folks who are in the kind of atheist Darwinian camp or in the theistic evolution camp and would disagree with ID. So I think really the crucial question boils down to, what is the scientific evidence, the relevant scientific data? Have we understood it correctly? And then I guess if I had to highlight one other thing, it would be this importance of definitions again, of kind of straw manning definitions. So you often find theistic evolutionists critiquing Behe's work idea of irreducible complexity by straw manning his definition, just giving a definition of irreducible complexity, which is not the definition that Behe gave, and saying, for example, for something to be irreducibly complex means that it has lots of parts that do something, and if you remove one of those parts, it doesn't do anything, or that part doesn't have any other function somewhere else, and then say, well, there's a part or there's a subset of parts within some system that can achieve another function. So people have looked at the bacterial flagellum, and they've said that there's actually a sort of a protein pump that's a subset of the parts within the flagellum, and that there are bacteria that use protein pumps to inject things. And therefore, the bacterial flagellum is not irreducibly complex. But that's not using the definition that Behe gave for a start. It's a bit like saying, because there's a fuel pump in your car engine, that shows that the car engine is not irreducibly complex and therefore not designed. Well, the pump itself is irreducibly complex for a start, so that needs explanation. How it closely integrates to function with all of the other parts to achieve the function of being a motor still needs explaining, and there's loads of other parts where you're going to get them for, and how does that coordination happen? And in the case of the bacterial flagellum, the best kind of genetic data seems to show that the protein pump came into existence as a standalone feature later than the bacterial flagellums did. So if anything evolved from anything, it was the pump kind of coming out of the flagellum rather than vice versa. So maybe the pump is a devolved product of the whole system. But you need look into the data about what is the temporal ordering of these these things, and it doesn't work out in favor of that explanation. So just kind of straw manning the argument by not paying close attention to the arguments, and sort of he said, I never said that the parts of an irreducibly complex thing couldn't themselves have other functions within the cell. Indeed, in Darwin's black box, he explicitly said that could be the case.
Yeah.
He'd already dealt with that argument in the original book that he published it, and yet that is still being used as an argument against the prime trot-out, knockdown argument against his idea, is one that he himself had already mentioned and discussed in his book.
I hear you saying, that ultimately what matters is whether or not ID is true, and to avoid the straw manning. I was curious as to, do you also see trying to equate, because I know this was going on for a while, but a lot of people I've heard they'll say something along the lines of, intelligent design is just a creationism Trojan horse. I've even heard someone like Michael Shermer call it intelligent design creationism.
Yeah.
Do you still see that happening a lot too, trying to equate the two? And then, of course, how would you best address that?
Yeah, it's a way of committing the fallacy of poisoning the well, or damning by association.
Precisely. Yeah.
Rather than taking it in its own terms. I think it's a disreputable way of treating an academic idea to do that to it. But I think I'm a good example of, I came from a theistic evolutionist background. I became persuaded of intelligent design theory, but my theology didn't change. I didn't become a young Earth creationist off the back of it, even. So I am not, nor have I ever been, a member of the Young Earth Creationists fraternity. I simply moved from theistic evolution to thinking that, intelligent design theory was true, and that was also compatible with a theistic worldview and with my Christianity.
Excellent. And then just kind of beginning to wrap up before we let you, of course, share where our listeners can find you and your great work. I was wondering, how has the study of ID impacted your own relationship with God?
As I say, it didn't really shift my theology. I think in the years since, I've started thinking more about the interpretation of the second creation narrative in Genesis about Adam and Eve and so on. And there's very interesting debates, series of publications at the moment going on about the discussion about science and genetics and Adam and Eve and so on, and how you interpret them if you consider them to be real people rather than merely as metaphors or kind of archetypes. When I was a theistic evolutionist, I very much had a kind of metaphorical, archetypal, purely metaphorical kind of reading of them, and I've kind of shifted that over the years. But I don't think that's particularly connected to my thinking about intelligent design, although it's been sort of in the wake of that. But again, I'm still not minded to take a young Earth creationist interpretation of either of the creation narratives in Genesis. I tend to the view that sees them as sequential rather than as talking about the same events and so on. But it's still one of the areas that I'm kind of thinking through, and it's still clearly one of the areas that Christian community at an academic level are thinking through. Thinking through some kind of new proposals, and I love it when an area that people have been thinking about in theology for thousands of years, people can come up with new ideas in that area, partly because of new science. And so folks like Joshua Swademas and his book on genealogical Adam and Eve, and work that has been done by some in the ID community on the genetics of, is it actually consistent with population genetics to have an original couple and all humans descended from them? There used to be arguments that wasn't consistent with population genetics. And as far as I understand it now, even folks at sort of theistic evolutionist groups like Biologos would concede that it actually now is consistent, although not necessarily the most plausible model of population genetics to say that there was an original couple. For myself, whether or not one views Adam and Eve as the original and only humans from whom all other humans descend is still an open question. I'm minded to see them as actual people, but not necessarily as first people. This whole question of whether other people outside of the garden, questions about, where did Cain get his wife? Why are there enough people around suddenly for Cain to be building a city? Who is he afraid of when God exiles him after killing his brother? Anyone who finds me will kill me. Who is he worried about if he's being exiled away into the land of Nod, and so on. So I think those are, very interesting questions, and science brings and can continue to bring new things to that discussion. So, get into the discussion that's being had by folks like Joshua Swademas. William Lane Craig recently wrote a book on Adam and Eve, John Garvey, etc. There's a number of interesting works in that whole discussion at the moment, and it's one that, science brings something to the discussion, but so does our theology, our interpretation of scripture, which is, again, affected by our theology, our understanding of ancient cultures, our understanding of ancient languages, our philosophy. You get into these really interdisciplinary areas of thinking when you're trying to form what's called a synoptic Christian worldview. A synoptic as in like the synoptic gospels, that kind of seeing Christ from these different perspectives of these different authors, but all talking about the same thing. We're trying, in the end, to come up with a synoptic worldview that makes the best sense we think we can make out of all the sources of knowledge, of warranted beliefs that we think we have. And that is a fallible human discipline, right? Whatever you believe about
Right.
biblical inspiration and authority, our reading and interpretation of Scripture is a fallible human practice. That's obvious from the fact that Christians disagree about things, and we particularly have lots of disagreements about the very beginning of the Bible and the very end of the Bible. And why is that? It's because those two bits of literature in Genesis and in Revelation are really difficult to interpret and understand.
Indeed.
They're kind of very remote from our Western 21st century culture, and the process of understanding God's world in the best way goes on being informed by our understanding and our evolving understanding of Scripture. And part of the reason that evolves over time is because our interpretations are affected by our knowledge of other things. And that knowledge grows over time. And so you would expect that. You expect to have kind of a core unity in the sources and in kind of the creedal kind of structures. And I often tell people that Christians agree on the doctrine of creation, but we have very different models or pictures of creation. And you can say the creed together, but disagree about your model of creation. And actually, you don't have to believe or assume a particular model of creation in order to believe or even just assume the truth of the doctrine of creation. And so again, what issues are primary and what issues are secondary? God created. We're here for a purpose. There is a meaning and purpose of life. That's a big worldview difference to naturalism or to pantheism or whatever. And that worldview sets a context within which the Christian story of Christ makes sense. But as to the particular ins and outs of your interpretation of the kind of the model or picture of creation that you have in mind, that is a secondary or kind of tertiary issue here. And I think we should bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly important to make sure that we're majoring on the primary issues and allowing freedom in those secondary issues. I concur.
Right.
I just wanted to say before Brian wraps things up, I just wanted to just personally thank you for your work and just let you know how much I enjoy it and how encouraging it's been to my own walk.
Brad, thank you. That's encouraging to me as well. So thank you for saying that.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us, Peter. We'll point people to your resources and your website in the show notes. Anything new on the horizon that we should be calling you back about?
Well, one project that I'm very excited about at the moment is I'm an amateur composer as well. You'll notice that there's a composing tab on my website. And I used to work with a now rather old-fashioned composing software that would, once you'd programmed in the notes, would make a computer recording of your music for you using sampled instruments. But I realized the other day that my computer software was like 13 years out of date. And with all of this discussion about, artificial intelligence and so on, I would lay money that computers these days are not limited to the choir just going, ah. So, I had scores with words written under the choir parts, but the computer could only reproduce them with a choir that went, ah, 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 ah. But computing technology has come on and off these days that an artificial choir can do a pretty darn good job of actually singing the lyrics. And so I've reached out over the internet. I'm working with a collaborator that I found through the internet to use my original Somalia 6 composition files to convert them into modern computing music software and to produce new recordings of my kind of Christian and modern classical music with the choir actually singing the lyrics that I have there. And so it makes the music much more accessible to the normal audience who might not want to sit there with a score printed out, reading the words and kind of imagining what it should sound like. They'll be able to hear a pretty good approximation using modern samples and so on of what I imagined in my head when I was composing it. So that project is currently underway, and I hope to have it out later this summer, of the new recording of particularly this suite of music that tells the story of the biblical worldview. That's called From Glory to Glory, that goes from just God pre-creation through creation, through the story of Christ, and to thinking about Christian living now in a world of suffering in the light of the hope of glory. So
very cool.
Exciting.
Great. Thanks again, Peter, and all the best.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.